Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream. Today, add Swaziland to the list of countries looking for a bailout. But will the last absolute monarch in Africa accept the tough terms in time? It's a topic you've asked us to cover. Now, Malika Bilal is here looking out for your live feedback. She's in for Ahmed Shihab El-Din. Welcome, Malika.
Thank you.
Also joining us on the couch is Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of the UN Dispatch blog. Mark, I know that you've been writing some really fascinating stuff, but you've also got a new project aside from the blog. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks. I started a new social venture with a partner of mine, another blogger named Tom Murphy. And what we call it the Development and Aid Workers News Service. And it is a daily digest of global humanitarian news into which for which people subscribe, a very low monthly subscription fee of about $2 or $3. And we use those fees to reinvest in global humanitarian journalism and storytelling.
So what does this mean? It means if I'm a subscriber, I can get all kinds of organization that is related to global development or that is targeted towards people who work in global development?
It's targeted towards people who follow global humanitarian news, broadly speaking. We comb sort of news sources that don't sort of generally get percolate up into the mainstream Western news. And we're able to find trends of global reporting, and we report on those trends, we report on those stories in a sort of really easy to digest, hence the name digest.
So you can help people pinpoint that data. Thanks so much for giving us some insight into that. I'm glad that you're here with us because what we're talking about today, both stories today do have a strong humanitarian component. Very interested to get your thoughts.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. Of course, this show is all about you, our community. So if you've got a story to share, follow us and tweet it to us using the hashtag AJStream.
This is the part of the show where we take a quick look at the stories you've shared. Hamas and Israel began the first stage of a prisoner swap that will see 1,027 Palestinians exchanged for one captured Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was released Tuesday. Many Palestinian families are celebrating, as this picture from Twitter user Lina El Safin shows, while others are protesting the conditions of those who remain imprisoned. Now, the swap has been trending worldwide on social media sites, so we wanted to join you in this conversation and take a closer look. Last week, we asked you to complete the hashlib 1 for 1,000 means, and here are a few of your answers. Twitter user Farah Amalia from Indonesia writes, 1 for 1,000 means that the 1 was unfortunate and the 1,000 were never a threat, or they wouldn't have given up 1,000 for 1. And from Jerusalem, Avi Meyer tweets, 1 for 1,000 means Israel is taking significant risks and reopening painful national wounds in order to bring a young man home. Well, to shed some light on this issue, we're joined by Noura Erakat, a Palestinian attorney and adjunct professor of international human rights law at Georgetown University. Noura, thanks for being with us. Can you tell us, what does 1 for 1,000 mean to you?
To me, it signifies the asymmetry in the conflict between the Palestinian people and the Israeli state. It's the disparity between a country with an army and economy, sovereignty, borders, control of its airspace, and a people still struggling for their self-determination. So that it's quite possible and amenable to the rest of the world watching that one soldier can influence Israel to trade 1,000 of its supposed terrorists with blood on their hands.
Now, Noura, tell us, what is the impact on this for Hamas? Because some are saying that this actually will impact their perception among the Palestinian people because it's going against one of what would seem to be the base tenets of their existence.
Well, Hamas, for all intents and purposes, is a resistance organization that has increasingly become a political party, and one that is not only part of government, but is the ruling government. And so there's an association with Hamas, which has endured the siege for the past 4 years, that it will do everything in reaction to and in resistance to Israeli occupation. And yet here we see it behaving in ways much more much more characteristic of governing authorities and states. And so it's making rational decisions. But this shouldn't be a surprise to those who have been watching Hamas steadily change its course, first agreeing to a two-state solution, although not the permanent solution, then agreeing to negotiate with Israel, and also entering into a unity government with Fatah, that this is part of its trajectory as more and more a credible political party and not just one that's based on resistance, although it maintains a resistance platform.
So, Mark, I mean, is this a step potentially in the right direction?
It seems so. I'd be curious to know sort of what this means for Fatah. You know, they have approached the issue of Palestinian membership of the United Nations. And, you know, Abbas made this huge speech at the UN, was well received, but then that's gone nowhere. And here you have Hamas pursuing a separate strategy, but they have a lot to show for it all of a sudden. And it seems to have increased their influence vis-a-vis Fatah significantly.
What do you think about that, Noura?
I think that that's right, and I think there has been commentary that Hamas is stealing the thunder of Fatah from its UN bid, whereas Hamas can bring out 1,000 prisoners, 10 of whom have been in Israeli detention longer than Mandela was on Robben Island. And that all Fatah can do is give a speech at the UN. I think that's not quite credible, and in fact, on the ground, there's a jubilant spirit of national unity because many of those who have been released are also going back to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and represent a broad spectrum of political parties. That said, this agreement is rife with not just inequality in numbers, but also an inequality in its application that contravenes international law on this, and specifically contravention of Article 49, which prohibits the deportation or forcible transfer of civilians in occupied territories out of their territory.
Thank you, Noura. I think that's all the time we have for now, but thank you for joining us in the stream and giving us your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Well, of course, this show is all about you, our community. So if you've got a story to share, like us on Facebook, post your pitch, and it could end up in the stream. Like our next segment, which was requested by Sean Burke and Stuart Bolis. Their topic is coming up in the stream.
I am Georgia Popplewell, Managing Director of Global Voices, and I'm in the stream.
Government budget cuts, protests, and demands for reform are being heard around the world. But in Swaziland, could these pressures be the beginning of the end for the last absolute monarch on the continent? King Mswati III has ruled his country for 25 years. Opponents accuse him of corruption and say that he squanders the country's wealth on luxuries. I want to show you a little bit of footage of two things that I think give a little context to what we're talking about in the way in which the king lives and how some Swazis feel about it. This is a clip of his daughter at their palace.
Cribs wouldn't tour any other cribs if there's all this. I'm joking. This is where the king sees all his most important visitors. Well, not really, but just one of the rooms, because the other one is the one we've just been in. Oh, did we go there? No, we didn't, did we?
Now, as you can see, this home is actually quite opulent and quite large. There are a number of different scenes here, but what I want to do is show you a little bit of the contrast. This is from a video, actually a documentary that was made by one of our upcoming guests, and I just want you to see a little of how the people here think about their own lives and what they are dealing with. He mentions that these are the shacks where his people live, and as they go into it, he actually provides some context of what we're discussing, which is basically the comparison between how they live and how the king lives. And as he says, as you think from this, you can have a clear understanding of what's going on here in that country. Now, Swaziland's government has relied on a shared revenue agreement with the South African Customs Union to fund much of its affairs. But with the financial crisis, trade has actually dried up, and more than a third of the national income has gone with it. The country's former finance minister has argued that another 125 million is lost each year to corruption. Now, these deficits have meant that social unrest social service benefits have been cut, and that has led to a certain measure of social unrest. You've seen drops to assistance for orphans and the elderly, and with a country with an estimated 40% unemployment rate and 70% of the population living in poverty, these cuts could be life-threatening for some. Since April, protests have been occurring across a number of Swazi sectors, from teachers and transport workers to those calling for democratic reform. Now, Swaziland has two choices: to accept a $355 million loan from South Africa, which would require the country to make democratic reforms, or take a $1.3 billion loan from Qatar with no political reform strings attached. Now, we have two guests that we're trying to get up on Skype that will be joining us shortly. We've got from the financial capital of Swaziland, Manzini, Mary Pais da Silva. She's the coordinator for the Swaziland Democracy Campaign. Also with us is filmmaker Michael Skolnick, who directed the award-winning documentary on Swaziland called Without the King, which you just saw some clips of just moments ago. Before we bring our Skype guests on, while our team is getting them ready, you know, Michael, when you see this contrast between the people in the King's Palace and how the actual normal people think, I guess one of the questions, or Liv, one of the questions that comes to me is, why now? Why hasn't there been this kind of unrest perhaps prior?
You know, it's a good question, and you know, one thing I worry about when you have unrest like this, and it's something that we actually saw with civil unrest in Côte d'Ivoire a year ago. You know, one thing to keep in mind about Swaziland is that it has the highest HIV rates around the world.
Yeah.
Highest HIV prevalence.
Well, they've got, I think, between people ages 15 to 49, you've got a 25% infection rate.
And unrest like this can affect people's access to treatment. And once you start losing access to treatment for a month or 2 months or even a few weeks sometimes, you can build up resistance to that first level of treatment. And then you're forced to go on the second level of treatment, which is sometimes unavailable, which is particularly unavailable in poorer countries like Swaziland.
Yeah, well, we're lucky actually because we do have our guests joining us now, and I want to get some of their insights on this. Mary, thank you for being with us, Michael, as well. Mary, I want to start with you. We just heard Mark raise the issue of how the cuts in social services can affect people who potentially have been affected with HIV in their access to treatment. What are some of the other practical concerns that these cuts may have, or that people are concerned about with the results of the cuts?
Thank you for having me on the show. The results that we're looking at is with a country that has the highest HIV prevalence rate in the whole world and the lowest life expectancy rate and the highest poverty rates and unemployment rate, we are looking at a situation where we are talking about a dire situation and it's going to get worse. We are talking of a situation that could result in a genocide, people dying of simple hunger because there are no social services that the government is giving to them. The social grants that are giving out, the very few that are there, very minimal social grants that are given out, are at the mercy of the government. You know, these people that are expecting something from the government have got nothing coming to them from the government. And people are literally dying of hunger out there and literally living from hand to mouth.
But Mary, let me ask you a question. The difference in the ways in which people have been living has been existing for quite a while, that income disparity. So what is it that has made people so concerned now that some are arguing this might threaten the reign of the monarchy?
The concerns are that initially Swaziland was a self-sustaining economy, you know, economy that was thriving in agriculture and self-production. But now those the economic crisis have hit hard. Many businesses are running out, they're closing down, people are losing their jobs, the agricultural sector is affected. People that used to live on subsistence farming are not able to do that anymore. And so obviously they're now relying more on food donations and donor funding for their daily lives. And this is being cut off because of the economic crisis and the fact that the government and our donors out there are not able to meet the needs of the people.
Okay, so Michael, I want to play something and I would like you to respond. This is a clip from your documentary film, Without the King, and I'm just going to explain it for our viewers, what it's showing here. There's a lady, the gentleman has brought us in, she's poking something out. He's saying, these are the intestines that we are selling. And she's putting them, they said they come from a dump site. These people go there and take these intestines and come and sell it here. Now you see that the people, he makes another statement that I think is worth mentioning. He says, this is not a joke, it's real life, this is what is happening. And he finishes with something that is quite profound in making that comparison to the king. He says, this is what they're going to have for lunch while the king is eating pizza. So Michael, as you were making this film, what sentiment did you feel from the average Swazi about the monarchy?
Well, Derek, it's a pleasure to be on the show, and Mary, love to you in Swaziland. It's good to see you. I think when I first went out to make this film, I went out to make a film about the king and his family and his wives and his many children. And I spent a number of weeks with the family, personal time with the family, got to know the family very, very well. I've known them for about 15 years now. And when I came back to New York after my first trip of filming, I got a phone call from a gentleman who said, "You haven't seen the real Swaziland, and when you come back, I want to show you the real Swaziland." When I returned the next trip, I was taken to the village that you were talking about in the film. I think the challenge here with Swaziland is that on paper, for the West, it looks really good. And when you look at Africa, Swaziland ranks in the top 10 as a middle-income country. So when you look at it on paper, it looks really, really good. The problem is the wealth is in the hands of very, very few. So 70% of that country is living under 70 cents a day. So what I was seeing with the young men in the village who were eating chicken intestines, that's common throughout many parts of the country. We just don't see it necessarily because of this mirage of a monarchy and a multi-millionaire family that sort of outweighs the income for the rest of the country. So I saw I've traveled the world making films, and I saw some of the most horrible things I've seen in my lifetime in Swaziland because of desperation, because of the HIV rate, because of the poverty rate. We're talking poverty rates in par of southern Niger or southern Sudan or parts of Chad. As Mary pointed out, although the king and his family have a wealth of money, most of the country, majority of the country, 70% of that country is living on poverty rates that we're seeing in other parts of Africa, in which we send in troops and send in a number of social services. So I think Swaziland is very fragile.
On that point, I actually want to talk about these protests that have been taking place in the country, and we've seen that there has been some violent response, that foreign journalists were ejected. Mary, I want you to hear some commentary that we received earlier today from the current finance minister, Mr. Majozi Sitole, about the Swazi constitution and its ability to allow people to protest. Let's hear what he had to say.
The Constitution provides for freedom of speech and everything. People are free to say their things. Different political groupings are able to articulate what they want to say. So it is not true that people are not allowed to speak their minds. They do. And as a matter of fact, time and again, we are even guided by what they are saying and try to respond or even act on what they are saying.
So he's saying the government is responsive. How would you respond?
I would say the government is responsive in brutalizing the people, because there is no freedom of expression in Swaziland. There is no freedom of assembly. I don't know in which Swaziland this man lives. You cannot have a country where you say we've got a constitution that protects the rights of the citizens, but where these citizens, whenever they are attempting to exercise these rights, they are brutalized by the security forces. The meetings are broken up by the security forces. People are arbitrarily arrested. They are taken, dumped all over in the remote areas of the country, and with no protection whatsoever from the state. I mean, these are innocent people who have no equipment to defend themselves against these security forces that are heavily armed using taxpayers' monies. So this man that is saying that we've got freedom of assembly and association should take a look in the mirror and actually speak the honest truth. We do not have these freedoms in Swaziland. The Constitution provides for them, but it's got clawback clauses within it which gives freedoms with one hand and takes them away with another hand. The 1973 decree that the government says has been superseded by the Constitution is still in full force and effect inside Swaziland. The Public Order Act that states that whenever there are any gatherings of any sort that are going to be held inside the country must seek the permission and acknowledgement of the police is still in force. So what rights is this constitution actually protecting?
So on that point, Mary, I actually want to come to some of the comments from our community who are asking similar questions. Malika?
Mary, I posed this question to you. This is a tweet we have from Priya Changala, who says, what do you believe the protesters are protesting for, reform or revolution? And then on that note, if this is reform or if it's revolution, is there a foreseeable path to reducing the king's powers, and what would that be?
It is very simple. We have our demands that will bring about the change that we want. And they are very basic, they are very simple. There's 5 of them. The first one is the unbanning of political parties. The second one is the removal of all the laws that restrict political participation, including the 1973 decree, which brought a state of emergency inside Swaziland. The third one is the restoration of the Bill of Rights, including freedom of assembly and association. The fourth one is that we want the unconditional release of political prisoners and the return of political exiles. And the fifth one, which will then set up exactly what we're looking for, is the setting up of an all-inclusive process of political negotiations to work out an alternative political framework within which the country will embrace all political parties and civic organizations. So yes, the king's powers have got to be stripped down. He should just be a ceremonial one and not be involved in the politics of the country.
Well, now I want to bring one other point, though, from the government perspective, because it's well and good to say that we want more political freedoms that reduce the king's powers, but the country is facing an economic crisis. Here is what the finance minister said about this South African loan. And the question of, actually, he kind of dodged the question about whether they were going to take the South African loan or the Qatari loan, but let's just take a quick clip of what he had to say.
We have negotiated the deal with the South African government, and now we are just agreeing on the interpretation of the contents of the Memorandum of Understanding, which has to be signed by the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Swaziland and his...
So basically, he's saying that they're, close to getting this deal done with the South Africans. First of all, May, I want to ask you, and then I'm going to come to Michael. May, first, have you heard anything about this Qatari loan? Because he's saying that that was never on the table and that they are going to receive assistance from South Africa.
The only loan that we know about is the one with South Africa. The loan from Qatar hasn't been openly declared, and we are not sure of its conditions, if any. But whatever happens, we wish to inform any government, including the government of Qatar or any individual that wishes to bail out Swaziland, that civil society and political parties will continue to deny the Swazi government any legitimacy, and we will continue with our mass actions until our demands are met. So they must just not waste their money on the Swazi government. Until there's a government of the people in place.
Now, Michael, I want to get your thoughts on this next point that's coming in from Gael Masengi online.
Basically, he asks, or he says, really, he's stating the question, the comment that Swaziland needs political reform through pressure from donors, not an uprising. What do you think about that, Michael?
Well, I think our dear friend in Swaziland, Mary, has a good point. The people of Swaziland, from my understanding, it's not that they're against the king. They're against the king being in political power. They're against the abuses of the royal family and the economic struggles of that country. I've always believed the solution for Swaziland is a Swazi solution. It's not a solution from the outside donors, not a solution from foreign governments, not a solution from the West. It's a solution from Swaziland. People of Swaziland know what's best for the country, and they do what's best for the country, and ultimately that country will be a democracy. I know it in my heart. I've been there many, many times, and that country will be a democracy. If you look at countries across the continent of Africa, and now, of course, what you see in our country and across Western Europe, people are fed up with the inequality of economic justice in this world, not just in sub-Saharan Africa or in third world countries, but in first world countries. The people will demand a change, and when the people demand a change has to happen.
Mark?
So you said you're convinced that this will be a Swazi solution, but I think it's undeniable that South Africa wields pretty strong influence over affairs in Swaziland, and as of late, South Africa hasn't necessarily been promoting human rights and democracy abroad. We saw them recently deny the Dalai Lama a visa to speak at Desmond Tutu's birthday ceremony, and the government is also in the process of deporting thousands of Zimbabweans as well. I want to know, what role does or can South Africa play, and do you expect that to be at all a positive role?
So now, before you answer, that's an excellent question, and unfortunately, we're out of time in the main block of the show, but Mary and Michael, I'm going to ask both of you to stay with us in the post-show, and we're going to talk about this question of South Africa's role. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Michael, for being with us, and thank you, Mark, for helping to contextualize this and for expanding the conversation. Thank you, Malika, for helping get our community involved. We're going to continue the conversation. What's happening in Swaziland is very serious, and as we've mentioned, the public health considerations due to the overwhelming nature of the AIDS crisis there make this that much more sensitive an issue. Stay with us. Join us at stream.aljazeera.com. We'll continue the conversation there. Continue to be with us using the hashtag AJStream. We'll see you online. Hi, welcome to the Post Show. We're going to continue our conversation here about what's going on with Swaziland. Recent cuts to social services have had people out in the streets. The government has had a violent response. The question now is, should the role and the power of the king be diminished? I want to come back to our guests, Mary the Pais da Silva and also Michael Skolnick. Mary, Mark just raised a very excellent question about the role of South Africa. How do you see South Africa playing a part in the future of your country?
We've seen the historical unfolding of the democratization of South Africa from apartheid. So we know the role that was played by smart sanctions, by sanctions against the country, to an extent that it put pressure on the government to give in to the will of the people. And another of our calls is that there must be sanctions against the Swazi government, wherein they won't be able to carry out any of their other duties because they will not be allowed to carry them out. And we all know that Swaziland is economically bound to South Africa. Our currency is linked to South African rand, and if anything were to happen in that kind of relationship, we know that Swaziland would be brought to its knees.
Okay, we're losing a little bit of audio from Mary. That was an excellent answer. Let's actually come to our community. Malika, I see you've got some stuff coming in from Facebook.
Right, actually, well, this Facebook post is from Sean Burke, who was one of the people that suggested that we do this story in the first place. And he says it's pretty worrying that the most vulnerable in Swazi society, their basic needs are struggling to be met by the government. And I think I'll pose this question to you, Mark. He says that there's a humanitarian crisis that's forming here and that, could threaten to spread. What are other governments doing, or what can they do to ensure that doesn't happen? And is the South African response, is that the correct response?
Well, it seems as if this is not on anyone's radar. I cover the UN pretty much for a living, and no one's talking about this at the United Nations, unfortunately. But it's one of those situations where the international community will take their cue from what the regional actors are doing. So they'll take their cue from South Africa. So really, I think at this point, the ball is in the South African government's court. And unfortunately, from what one of our guests says, it doesn't seem as if they're prepared to respond adequately.
Michael, I'm curious also from your perspective, having done this film about the monarchy, why has the Swazi monarchy lasted this long? What is it that has distinguished it from other regimes on the continent?
It's a good question. I think what's made this monarchy unique is I think what Mark just said. There's very little interest in Swaziland from an outside perspective. There's very few natural resources that can be taken out of the country now, except for some sugar that Coca-Cola was using for many, many years. But there's very few diamonds in the country. There's very, very little diamonds. There's very little gold. There's actually a marijuana trade that comes out of Swaziland and goes to parts of Africa. But there's very, very little natural resources from Swaziland, so there's not a lot of interest externally of Swaziland. And Swaziland during apartheid was a safe haven for many ANC members and many ZAPO members and other members to sort of go to and then slide out through Mozambique and up the east side of Africa, out of the continent or further up Africa. So I'm not sure. Someone just reminded me on Twitter that the film we made is actually banned in Swaziland. I'd forgotten that, and that it's actually, if you get caught with the film in Swaziland, you get charged with treason. I think that just that fact alone, the film, that's really just a portrayal of both sides, at least I think so. It doesn't really take sides, it shows both sides. That the monarchy won't let that film be seen by the people, I think is quite sad and also a testament to the oppression that people live under in that country.
May, speaking of that oppression, you made some very clear arguments for the needs or the interests that protesters have. How likely do you think you are to see substantive reforms in the near term?
It is very likely. I mean, the tide is turning for the Swazi citizen, the simple Swazi citizen. There's much pressure that is being put on the government. We've got so many crises, it's unbelievable. We have an education crisis, an economic crisis, a healthcare crisis. We have a judicial crisis now. And all these crises are actually building the spirit of the Swazi nation and bringing us together in such a way that we are actually going to see substantive change inside Swaziland in terms of the way that the Swazis are going to lead their own struggle. And from the pressure that we're building from within, we are also calling for pressure to come from the region, from Africa as a whole and the international community.
Well, I think your audio is dropping. We're losing a little bit of your audio, Mary, but thank you so much for being with us and for giving us your insights on this topic. It's been very enlightening. And thank you, Michael, also for your work in this area. We appreciate you both joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much.
This is really a fascinating take. And as you were saying, Mark, it seems like the international community is not really paying attention to what's happening here. What's your take on the likelihood that they're going to be able to see substantive reform if the international community does not take an interest?
You know, I think, like I said earlier, it really is up to South Africa to take the lead. But unfortunately, it seems to be one of the situations where if violence increases, that's probably the only way that the international community would take notice. I mean, you saw this. There's a certain connection, right, to the Arab Spring issues there. Yes. That it's once the regime started using, weapons, artillery, or in Gaddafi's case, bombs, to suppress dissent. That's when the international community stood up and took notice.
And you also see that in Swaziland, they expelled journalists. They tried to mitigate people's ability to report on what's happening, which is the same thing we saw in many North African and Middle Eastern countries as well.
It's true, and that's always sort of the first warning sign. The canary in the coal mine is when they start kicking out journalists or demanding their departure.
Well, it's great to have you here and giving us some of your own perspectives on that topic. I think we should move on. Malika, I know you've got a couple of stories that you've been following as well.
Exactly. We've reached out to our community on Reddit, which is the social aggregation website, to let them know about a couple of stories we're following and have asked them to add their comments to them. So one of the stories that we are looking at is out of Russia, where online network volunteers have gotten together and created this website called the Liza Alert. And you'll see this picture on my screen here. This is the website. And basically it's to help find missing children. In the US, I think there's something called the Amber Alert. Right. This is the Russian equivalent of that.
That's fascinating.
And then over in Pakistan, it is this picture that you'll see on my screen. Enlarge that a little bit. Oops, too big. Basically, train operations have come to a halt. They came to a halt yesterday across Pakistan. Railway workers are protesting because they haven't received their salaries and they want better conditions. So the president is apparently stepping in to look at the conditions of railway workers. But right now, train operations have ceased.
Okay.
And the last story that we're looking at is out of New York. Now, this came from the Occupy protest. This one was Occupy Times Square. And this is a video that we have of a U.S. Marine who's shouting at the New York Police Department, who have come to kind of break up this protest that happened in New York a few days ago. And I will play this clip here. It's gone viral, and you'll see why in a second. This is not war, this is not war. Why are you treating me like this, he says. And I'll fast forward a little bit.
I've actually seen this video, and he makes some really interesting points. And one of the things he asks is, he says, there's no honor in this, in what they're doing in beating the protesters. And I was actually at Occupy Wall Street over the weekend in New York, and I saw a number of people marching, and they were marching very peacefully, but I was tweeting that I saw the police with a massive presence, and they had all of those plastic handcuffs and things. It looked like they were ready for something. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Mark, as well, because I've never, I'm originally from Ghana, but I grew up in New York as well as in the Middle East. And the last time I can recall seeing such a profound police presence on the streets of New York was during the 2003 anti-Iraq war protest. I mean, what do you think is spurring this seemingly outsized response from the police forces to a peaceful protest?
It's hard to see what they think, what the NYPD thinks they can gain from coming down what seems to be pretty hard on the protesters. I'm sure you saw there are these videos going viral of one police officer parking his motorcycle on the leg of a lawyer. It turns out that he just ran over while the lawyer writhes in pain. At the same time, I think it's probably the case that just like, 99% of the people protesting are relatively sane, good, earnest, peaceful people, that most of the police officers are also probably just doing their best under difficult circumstances. Unfortunately, it's one of those cases where the bad apples, so to speak, are the ones caught on YouTube, are the ones that have their picture splayed everywhere.
Well, this was fascinating what he said in response. I know, Malik, you said there's some more footage that you wanted to share with us from his statement.
Exactly, just a little bit more here.
Everybody has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, where I did 14 months in Iraq. My father was in Afghanistan. My mother did a year in Iraq. We fought for this country. I don't come home. I'm in New York City. I am from New York City, and these cops are hurting people that I fought to protect. There's no reason for this. There's no honor in hurting unarmed civilians, and I won't let it happen. Have a good night.
I had read that he posted a statement the next day stating that he had actually been with Marines in Iraq during a 2004 riot where they actually exercised greater restraint. They were less violent as soldiers in stemming that riot against Iraqis than the police in New York are against their own people.
It's, probably the last good example of this sort of New York police versus protesters was the 2004 Republican Convention, where there were mass arrests. And these arrests, it turns out, were overturned. The convictions were and the police ended up the victim, or on the end recipient of a massive lawsuit that ruled in favor of the protesters, using sort of heavy-handed tactics like that.
Well, NYPD is allegedly out there to serve and protect, and so I guess we will find out who they're there to serve and who they're there to protect. Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us. Thank you also, Malika, for doing an excellent job. Thank you for joining us from our community. Remember, you can tweet us using the hashtag AJStream. We keep these conversations going on 24/7 online, so check us out at facebook.com/AJStream. We will see you online.